Welcome, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here this morning and talking about scaling, which is one of my favorite topics. I'm going to do something a little different today. Usually, when I give talks about this, I run through our book and describe the content in some detail. But rather than do that, what I want to do today is organize it as what I call these 5 big ideas. I don't know how big the ideas really are, but I've been doing quite a bit of training around scaling. I've had the opportunity to present a series of workshops in India. I've done trainings in the US and Canada and elsewhere, and quite a number online. And there are certain ideas that we present in our scaling work. By we, I mean me and Rob McLean, who works at IDRC. And some of these ideas strike people as either unusual or a little difficult to wrap their head around, or maybe provocative or requiring some change in how they approach their work. And I wanted to focus on those because I thought that they might provoke you to ask more questions. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A section of this. So I'm going to try to be brief in my presentation so that we can get to that more quickly. One of the results of that may be that I'm not going to go into too much detail on some of these ideas, and they may leave you a bit confused, but that's what questions are for. So why don't we go ahead and jump in? So what I'm going to talk to you about today really stems from this book that Rob and I wrote, which is called Scaling Impact Innovation for the Public Good. And I want to give you a little bit of a rundown of the book right now before I jump into the ideas and provide you with some understanding of what motivated us to write this book. Rob and I had found ourselves bumping into this idea of scaling quite a lot in our work, and we weren't quite satisfied with what we were seeing in terms of the writing and the way in which evaluation was fitting into this. And the cover of the book, I think, really has a picture that encapsulates what motivated us to write this. So this is a picture of a rural area in Mozambique. And to the bottom here is a banana plantation called Bananalandia. And it is so large that on its own, it transformed Mozambique from a net importer of bananas to a net exporter. This is huge. And above are these smallholder farms called mashambas that are scattered around the country. And dividing these two strategies for large-scale agriculture is this road, this bright line. And in looking at this, Rob and I were thinking, well, who decides where to draw that line? Who decides that these are the only 2 strategies to agriculture we're going to consider? How do we know if this has been done well? Who's responsible for doing it well? Who's affected by this? Who's at risk? Who's responsible for managing that risk? And the more we look around the world, the more we see that there are situations like this where large-scale strategies that are different butt up right against each other. And there's some sort of process, decision-making, choice that isn't made clear. And the way we would evaluate whether that choice has been made well is also not very clear. And we know from experience that there are a number of cases in which we're not that happy with the way scaling has turned out. And this is a picture that was shared with me by some colleagues at Engineers Without Borders. And I don't know that much about this, except that it's a village and it has wells. It has 1, 2, 3 wells. Each well was drilled by a different NGO. Each NGO had a mandate to scale, and each of the NGOs measured its success in scaling by how many wells it drilled. So they just went to the same villages and drilled wells. So this is a case in which this village probably would have been fine with just 1 well. And there may be 2 other villages out there that don't have wells because of this. But each of those NGOs were able to report that they were successful in their scaling. This, to me, doesn't represent successful scaling. And it's not just in the nonprofit sector. If we go to the for-profit sector, just reach into your pocket and pull out your phone. If you're a shareholder of Apple, this device has probably helped make you a lot of money. But if we think in terms of the public good, well, this has also helped spread disinformation. There are many issues around the mental health of young people that seem to be tied to the use of phones and other negative consequences. it becomes quite difficult to think about whether this is successful or not. It's quite a complicated problem and depends on whose perspective you're taking. And increasingly, there's a blend between that nonprofit world and the for-profit world. For example, with carbon credits. So many organizations that, like airlines, are buying carbon credits in order to offset the carbon they produce in their work. And many of these carbon credit organizations are nonprofit or somehow trying to serve the public good. But there's been quite a lot of news recently about how these are not necessarily producing much good. The credits may be worthless, and there's also a huge financial stake for many of these organizations, lots of money to be lost. It's hard to look at carbon credits, which is something which grew quite quickly and scaled quite quickly, as being successful. So in looking at all this, Rob and I are faced with this question that we kept asking each other: what is successful scaling? And since it depends on your perspective, and Rob, who worked at IDRC, said, well, why don't we do this by looking and talking to Southern innovators? These are the people who are charged with doing the scaling. These are the people who have to live with the consequences of much of our scaling. Let's talk to them. And that's what we did. Rob reviewed about 30 years worth of grant making that had taken place at IDRC. We involved innovators from around the world. And we took everything that we learned, which we think is quite different from what we had been reading in the literature, and put it in our book and organized that around 4 principles. And those principles are justification, that scaling is a choice, that choice should be based on evidence and values, and the choice is shared with the people who are affected. Optimal scale, bigger is not always better. What you're seeking when you're scaling is something that's optimal. So there are trade-offs, and you have to figure out what those are and for whom. Coordination, one organization is unlikely to achieve the impact at scale that it wants, so it usually requires some coordination. And dynamic evaluation, and I'm going to talk more about this, the idea that scaling creates dynamic change and requires a different way of thinking about and approaching evaluation. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail here, but of course you can read the book and read more about it. There are also 5 case studies. We wanted to see how those principles played out in practice, where they worked, where they didn't work. And the case studies, they're pretty varied. There's one that deals with Chagas disease prevention in Central America, justice for survivors of sexual violence in India, salt reduction in Latin America, policy that looks across various countries in the global South, and a kind of market-based approach to introducing fortified sunflower oil in Tanzania. So they're quite different in what was being done and where the context in which the work was being done. And sometimes the principles worked out quite well, sometimes they didn't, and that's covered in the case studies. Perhaps the most important thing about the book is we're really encouraging people to develop a different mindset around scaling, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I think our thinking right now, at least in North America, when we talk about scaling, is quite narrow, and it doesn't take into account the way scaling can work, where it can go wrong, and how people are affected. Now, I learned from David Federman I should show lots of pictures of my book so that people go out and buy it. But what I didn't learn from David Federman is that I'm giving my book away for free. So I need to talk to David some more. And you can get it for free online. You can buy a hard copy if you want, but electronic copies are free, and you can get it there. And all you have to do, if you can't remember that, is type in Scaling Impact IDRC. You'll get a couple of top hits that look like this. If you go to this one, which is about scaling impact innovation, takes you right to the book. If you go to the other one, which is about scaling science, which is a larger topic under which our research on scaling impact falls, then you'll get more resources if you'd like them, some other pieces that we've written. There's a playbook, and you'll learn about something which is called the Scaling Exchange, which I think is really quite interesting, which is a group of scaling fellows from around the world who are from the global South, who are really looking at what scaling means for them in their own context. And for our friends in Canada, yes, you can get it in French. It's been translated. And around the world. French is spoken in many places. All right, so that's a brief summary of the book. Now I'm going to just jump into the 5 big ideas. And idea number 1 is that organizations are responsible for all their impacts. I would say this is true all the time, not just with scaling, but it becomes particularly important with scaling because there's so much uncertainty about the kinds of impacts that will be created. In talking about this, we have to spend some time defining impact, or at least thinking about it a little bit differently. And for many evaluators, this is somewhat of a troubling idea. So most evaluators come to thinking about impact from logic models. That's maybe the place where they've learned about it, where they defined it. And in logic models, impacts are some of the consequences of an activity, right? Outputs and outcomes are also consequences, but we don't include them. They're typically the most important. They're typically the last to occur. And in logic models, they typically have an implied counterfactual. And what I mean by that is when we talk about an impact, we're usually saying that somehow the activities have made the world different or made something about the world better. Well, if it's different or better, we're comparing it to something. And that something to which we're comparing it is called a counterfactual. And in logic models, it's often not stated explicitly. We're left to imagine what that point of comparison is. Now, the one that we use in the workshops that we present in thinking about scaling is that we're interested in all the consequences, not just the ones we like, not just the ones that we might call impacts versus outcomes, but all of them. And they could be of any importance because what's important to me may not be important to you and vice versa. Also, what's important right now might change, right? It might seem very important now and become less important later, may become important later and be less important now. Want them to occur at any time after the activity, and we'd like an explicit counterfactual. And the challenge here for many is that if an organization is responsible for all its impacts, and we don't know what all of them might be, and you're asked to evaluate what's going on with an organization when it's scaling, it can seem overwhelming. How do you approach this? And there are strategies for this. We do have to prioritize. We can't look at everything. But it doesn't change the fact that the organizations are responsible for everything that occurs when they scale, not just the things they like or they decide to look at. And so this changes the nature of how we approach evaluating scaling, how we design scaling efforts, how we manage them. This has led to rich discussions in the workshops and the consulting work that we've done. All right, number two, there are many ways to scale. Oftentimes organizations talk about how they're going to scale. They're going to scale up, something is scaling ready, but they're not always clear on what they're going to do to make that scaling happen. And so when organizations are scaling, what they do is they act differently. And I want to emphasize differently because it doesn't necessarily mean they're getting bigger or spending more money or working with more people or in more places. It might mean that, but they're acting differently. There's a qualitative change in what they do. And to be clear, we talk about that as changing operational scale. That's just the expression we've landed on to be clear about that aspect of scaling. And there are different strategies for changing operational scale. And so some terms you might have heard, which are not consistently used, but tend to follow this line. For instance, scaling up. If you use a simple metaphor of an apple tree, then that's like growing the apple tree bigger so it grows more apples, versus scaling out, which would be planting more apple trees so that you get more apples. Now, there are many, many different approaches, right? So in addition to scaling up and scaling out, in the workshops and elsewhere, we talk about scaling deep, which is about making qualitative changes so that you improve quality. There's something called emergent scaling. There's horizontal scaling, vertical scaling, concentric scaling, social contagion scaling, monopolistic scaling, there's regulatory scaling, and there's scaling through acquisition. There's same scaling, which is a decision to kind of do the same thing over and over again. Descaling, which is bringing things down or stopping. There are various combinations of all of the above. And there's something which we like to refer to as faux scaling or, not scaling, which has all the superficial appearance of scaling, but none of the actual benefits. For example, putting 3 wells in one village would be an example of faux scaling. So the challenge here is that organizations have to choose their way forward when they're scaling. And there's a real design element here about finding the right strategy to fit your context and your purposes and the kinds of risks that you may be facing in your particular setting. And I don't think that as much time is spent on planning this out in scaling efforts as there really should be. This is quite a difficult task. All right, idea number 3, scaling is an intervention. All right, so we use the expression scaling an intervention quite a lot. You hear that all the time, but we want to argue that scaling is an intervention. As I said, when organizations scale, they act differently, but they act differently to make the impacts different, right? They're acting differently to make impacts different. And in that sense, scaling is an intervention. And this gives us some handles on thinking about how to evaluate scaling. It also raises a few questions like, how will impacts be different? And in the book, we talk about 4 dimensions. You can think about as many dimensions as you want. There's no sort of magic to this. One of them is magnitude, and this probably gets most of the attention. Organizations argue, well, if we scale, if we act differently, then more people will be better off, or the impact will be larger in some way. It'll be bigger. But also variety changes. The kinds of impacts you can create will change at different kinds of scale. It can change the equity of the impacts. It could also change their sustainability, which is particularly important for environmental impacts. So how will impacts be different is a great question to ask when someone is thinking about scaling. Another one is, how will acting differently make impacts different? So this gets to the idea that there has to be some sort of rationale or theory, some kind of scaling theory of change that allows you to connect your strategy for scaling to the way in which impacts will be different. And this is quite a different beast than the kinds of theories of change that we typically look at. Usually when we think about a theory of change, there's some set of rules about cause and effect that we're hoping to uncover. That in a particular context, if we take a particular kind of action, we should expect a particular kind of result. And once we figure that out, then if we could just repeat that, then we should get the same result. But it doesn't quite work that way with scaling. All right, that sort of theory might look like this. Think about operational scale on this axis, and as you move to the right, then you're doing things differently. You're doing more of something, or you're changing some qualitative aspect of how you're acting. And on the other dimension is impact, and as you move up, then the impacts are better. Maybe that means they're bigger, but they're better in some sense. And you go off and you do a pilot study and you are where that dot is. The theory that seems to prevail is just draw a line through that. Now, as I act differently, the impacts get better in some sort of constant relationship. I work with twice as many people, I get twice as much impact. If I spend twice as much to improve the quality of what I'm doing, I get some sort of commensurate change in the quality or size of the impacts I'm having. That there's just this straight line relationship that goes on forever. And that doesn't really seem to make sense because we're changing quite a lot when we scale, not just how we act, but we're changing quite a lot about context as well. And we know that this straight line doesn't work in many settings with scaling. For example, we've all become experts with vaccines and herd immunity. As we increase the number of people who are vaccinated, the relationship to its benefits don't look like this. It really looks something like that. It turns up. We have herd immunity at some time. And in one of the papers we've written, we've talked about how with a particular outbreak of Ebola, there was the application of a kind of cluster approach to the vaccination, looking for hotspots. And this qualitative change in the way that vaccines were applied actually moved that herd immunity point closer. So you got there sooner. So it's not just about more, it's also about qualitative differences, and you get these nonlinear sorts of relationships. Youth employment, you see the same thing. It's not a straight line as you begin to train more and more people. Well, at some point you've trained too many and the benefits go down. if you train them really well so that people become extremely efficient, that point actually moves closer because you need fewer and fewer people working. And if you think about equity, well, you also don't have a straight line relationship. In many advocacy and policy efforts to improve equity, what you find is you do a lot and a lot and a lot and nothing changes. And then suddenly there's a tipping point and things change. If there's a qualitative change of the strategies, like using social media more effectively, you might be able to move that there. All right, so these are all scaling effects. They're examples of scaling effects. They're nonlinear. They're hard to predict. And they change the way we think about something that we might call a scaling theory of change. This brings us to number 4, which is that a scaling theory of change must account for dynamic change. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. And this is, I think, one of the harder things to wrap your head around with scaling. At its core, theories of change are really thinking about the relationship between action and impact. Yes, and we can add lots of middle steps, and there can be lots of actions and lots of impact, but I'm trying to make it as simple and schematic as possible. This kind of relationship is the focus of what goes on, and it becomes the focus of what we call impact evaluation. It's the focus of a lot of summative evaluation, and it's the focus of a lot of investment evaluation. Impact investors try to predict this relationship as part of their decision-making process as to where to put money. And in a theory of change, we tend to believe that this relationship is static, that there's a kind of rule that we can discover, at least some of the time, and well enough that we can take this action with reliability. Add to that the way that context affects this. So this is kind of an odd picture. It has an arrow going to an arrow, but what it means is that context changes how actions affect impacts. So in some contexts, the actions affect the impacts in a way, you get the impacts you want. In other contexts, you don't get the impacts you want. And so this is just a graphical way of trying to explain what realist evaluation has been trying to convince us of for some time, and I think actually has. Context matters, and it interacts with the actions to determine the impacts. All right, so this is what we have to explain in a traditional theory of change, and I think we've done a reasonable job at that. But scaling changes all that, because scaling, again, is changing the action so we can change the impacts. So the impacts might become different because their magnitude changes, their variety changes, the equity or sustainability changes. And if we're particularly successful at this, it's quite possible that the impacts affect the context. And if the impacts affect the context, then now suddenly it may become more or less likely to create the impacts. The impacts may become larger or smaller from the same actions. They may appear faster or slower. We may see a different variety of impacts, or they may be impacts with different qualities. These are all scaling effects. And not all of them have names. Not all of them are predictable. In addition, scaling can also affect context directly. A classic example of that is crowding out. You are working in a context trying to solve a problem. You become large enough, important enough that no other competing innovations are funded. And that changes, at least from the perspective of the public good, how the actions create the impacts. So in the past, these were the two things that we were spending our time focusing on. We would explain these in a theory of change, and we would pursue them in our evaluations. But there are these 5 kinds of relationships that we're arguing we need to consider now when we're scaling. And under the heading of dynamic evaluation, this is what we're focusing on. So dynamic evaluation is really a stance. It's not a method or an approach, but it says that there are these dynamic relationships as we scale. We change context, and context changes what we do. And that is not something that I think we're well prepared to do as evaluators. Now, this picture is as simple as we think we can make it. It may be too simple. You may like arrows going in different directions. You might like different connections. You might want more intermediate steps. That's fine. You can expand upon this to your heart's delight. But we use this as a starting point, as something that hopefully won't blow apart a human brain in thinking about some very complex interactions. Idea number 5, think differently. This has been our greatest challenge as individuals approaching scaling. And I think it's definitely been the greatest challenge students and clients have in thinking about scaling. We've been arguing that to scale in a way that is judged to be successful by the people who are affected requires the people taking action to develop a different mindset. And that is very, very difficult. And for us, somewhat frustrating in that we can't describe precisely what that means. What does it mean? What does it mean to have that mindset? And we're competing with all this different kind of thinking you're supposed to be developing. Evaluative thinking, systems thinking, design thinking, critical thinking, developmental thinking. And to this, are we adding some notion of scaling thinking? I hope not. I think I think we don't need one more kind of thinking. But when scaling, we're using all those kinds of thinking in a particular way. And to develop that requires time, training, working with somebody who has moved further along than you, but if they admit it, are also trying to develop their thinking as well, that you never stop doing that. This is perhaps the most important part, and it's really the most difficult part. Well, I hope that those ideas have provoked some questions and not been entirely opaque. So let me here say thank you and see if we can move over to some questions.